I've never told anyone this. Not really. Not in the way I'm about to now. It's been over 50 years since Jacob disappeared, but there are days when it still feels like it happened just yesterday. I'm Dakota Nelson, and I was there, on that weekend camping trip to Gooseberry Reservoir in June of 1973. I was with Jacob. We were best friends, and I was the last one to see him. It started like any other Boy Scout trip. The sun was high and the weather perfect as we pulled up to the campgrounds just a couple of hours outside of town. Our troop was excited, 18 of us in all, ready to spend a weekend away from the noise of the world, fishing by the lake, sitting around the campfire. The kind of weekend where nothing ever feels like it can go wrong, but as you'll soon find out, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. Jacob was my best friend. We'd been through everything together, schoolyard fights, family problems, and endless camping trips. He wasn't just a friend, he was a brother. We'd always shared a tent on our trips. It had become a tradition. Our parents trusted the troop leaders, and so, by sunset, we had pitched our tents and set up camp by the lake. We spent the evening fishing from the dock and laughing about how many monster fish we'd supposedly caught. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the fire pit was alive with flames, and everyone sat around the fire telling ghost stories and making jokes. It felt normal, peaceful, too peaceful. After the stories, Jacob and I crawled into our tent to settle in for the night. I was exhausted, my head on the pillow, and the sound of crickets outside was all I could hear. That was when I heard him get up, the rustling of fabric, the soft shuffle of feet on the cold ground. "I'm just going to relieve myself," he whispered. I muttered something in response but fell back asleep almost immediately. What happened next would haunt me for the rest of my life. When I woke up again, the sky was still dark. The tent was cold. I looked over at Jacob's side of the tent. The space was empty. The door of the tent was wide open. "Jacob?" I called out softly, thinking he'd just stepped away for a moment. No answer. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. A sinking feeling began to grow in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I climbed out of the sleeping bag, shaking off the cold air. I called his name one more time before stepping outside into the dark night. The moon barely illuminated the campsite. The air was thick, heavy with silence, and it seemed like even the crickets had stopped their song. It was too still, too quiet. I walked around the perimeter of the camp, calling out for Jacob. No response. Nothing. The trees whispered in the wind, but nothing from my friend. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine, and I felt a chill deeper than the cool night air. Something wasn't right. I ran back to the campfire, now just embers glowing faintly, and woke the troop leaders. They didn't waste a second. They rallied the group, forming a search party. Everyone was up now, nervous, confused. No one had seen Jacob since he stepped out of the tent. We combed through the campsite first, calling out his name over and over. I wanted to believe he was just lost, that he'd wandered too far in the dark and would come back laughing at us for worrying. But the more we searched, the more I realized that wasn't the case. When we reached the edge of the forest, one of the boys, Darren I think, found something on the ground, a small dark stain. "Is that blood?" Darren's voice cracked as he knelt down. The group froze. It wasn't a lot, just a small pool, but it was enough to make my heart race in panic. "Get the leaders," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. It was shaky, almost distant. The leaders were quick to act. They pulled out flashlights, shining them across the ground in sweeping arcs, as if they could find something, anything that would explain this. "Maybe a bear or mountain lion," one of them suggested, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. The possibility of an animal attack felt wrong, though. Jacob wasn't the type to be careless. He knew the woods too well. We searched for hours. The entire group scoured the area in a wide grid, shouting his name, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no sounds, no trace. It was as if Jacob had vanished into thin air. The night dragged on, and we grew more desperate. Then came the moment that I'll never forget. We were all standing in a huddle near the edge of the woods when one of the leaders, Mr. Grayson, called us over. He had something in his hand, a small torn piece of Jacob's jacket. The fabric was frayed, the edges dark with what looked like more blood. That's when I felt it. Something in the air shifted. The weight of the night pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Get back to camp," one of the leaders ordered, his voice grave. The troop returned to camp, but no one slept that night. Not a single one of us. The flickering shadows of the campfire seemed to mock our helplessness. By morning, the leaders had made the decision to head to the nearest town and alert the sheriff. What followed was weeks of searching, search dogs, helicopters, a whole team of experts combing the woods, but there was no sign of Jacob. No trace. Nothing. The authorities eventually called off the search, and Jacob's parents, they never gave up hope. They kept hoping against all logic that he would come back, but he never did. I wish I could say that was the end of the story, that the nightmare ended there. But years later, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew. I wish I could forget what I saw that day by the reservoir. It was 15 years later when I went back to Gooseberry Reservoir. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe closure, maybe answers. Or maybe I was just chasing ghosts. By then, I was 28 years old, married, with a little boy of my own. But Jacob's disappearance had never left me. It stayed with me like a shadow, creeping into my thoughts at the quietest moments. The drive to the reservoir was longer than I remembered. The roads were rougher, the trees seemed taller, and the air carried an unsettling stillness. The place looked exactly the same as it had all those years ago. The water was calm, the forest dense, and the silence heavy. I came alone. My wife had begged me not to go. "Why do you want to dig all that up again?" she'd asked, her eyes filled with worry. I couldn't explain it to her. I didn't even understand it myself. All I knew was that something inside me needed to go back. I arrived early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. I carried a fishing pole with me, trying to convince myself that this was just a normal fishing trip, that I wasn't here to dredge up the past. I set up near the water, casting my line into the still lake. The ripples spread outward in perfect circles, disrupting the mirror-like surface. For a while it was peaceful, the kind of peace I'd remembered from before that terrible night. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A voice. Dakota. My name. Spoken softly like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze. My chest tightened as I whipped around, scanning the shoreline and the tree line beyond it. There was no one there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Dakota!" the voice called again, louder this time. And then I saw him. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Standing at the edge of the trees was a man, his frame thin and his shoulders hunched. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his body like they'd been shredded by time. His hair was long and unkempt, streaked with gray and dirt. But it was his face that stopped my heart. It was Jacob. "Jacob?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. My knees felt weak, and the fishing pole slipped from my hand. He stepped closer, his bare feet crunching on the dry leaves. His eyes met mine, and they were the same eyes I'd known as a boy. Only now they were sunken and filled with something I couldn't describe. Fear, pain, and something else. Something darker. "It's me," he said, his voice cracking. "It's Jacob." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My brain was trying to reconcile what I was seeing, but it didn't make sense. He looked older, but not by much. Not 15 years older. And yet here he was. What happened to you?" I finally managed to stammer. "They took me," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't explain it, Dakota. I don't have the words. But they took me, and I can't stay. You shouldn't be here. They're watching." "Who?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "Who's watching?" "Jacob, what are you talking about?" He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously toward the forest. His entire body was tense, like a deer ready to bolt. "I don't have much time. I came to warn you. Don't come back here. Ever. They'll take you too." Before I could respond, he turned and started to walk away. "Wait!" I yelled, chasing after him. But as I reached the edge of the trees, he was gone. Vanished, like he'd melted into the shadows. I stood there, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I called out his name over and over, but the forest swallowed my voice. The stillness returned, more oppressive than before. I didn't know how long I stood there before I finally stumbled back to the shoreline. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely gather my things. I didn't even bother to reel in the fishing line. I just left. Driving away from the reservoir, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow on the road, every rustling branch seemed alive with malice. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Jacob or something else chasing me. When I got home, I didn't tell my wife what had happened. I couldn't. How do you explain something like that? She knew something was wrong, though. She said I looked pale, like I'd seen a ghost. And maybe I had. To this day, I don't know what to believe. Part of me wonders if I imagined it, if my guilt and grief created some kind of hallucination. But another part of me knows it was real. I saw him, I spoke to him, and I can't shake the feeling that he was right, that something was watching us that night, and it still is. I haven't been back to Gooseberry Reservoir since that day, and I never will. Whatever happened to Jacob out there, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something I can explain or understand. But I know this. I'll carry the weight of that mystery and the fear of that place for the rest of my life. And I'll never forget the look in Jacob's eyes when he said, "They're watching,